Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
I'm Travis, 28, and I never thought I'd write one of these posts. But after the last week, I feel like I need to get this out. I guess this all started about a month ago, right after I got out of the hospital from a car accident that left me with a fractured leg and a pair of crutches I now feel are extensions of my body. It wasn't a terrible accident. I wasn't speeding or doing anything stupid, but it was enough to knock me off my feet for a while, literally. For someone like me, who's always been independent and used to managing my own life, suddenly being entirely reliant on other people was frustrating, humbling, and honestly, a little humiliating. I'd always been the responsible one in my family, the one everyone turned to when they needed help, and I figured that reputation would at least earn me some basic decency while I healed. Turns out, that was wishful thinking. My brother, Alex, is 6 years older than me and has always been difficult, to put it mildly. Growing up, he was charming, funny, and magnetic, and everyone in our family adored him. Parents, aunts, cousins, they all ate out of his hand, while I quietly did the work, did the chores, got the grades, and generally stayed out of the spotlight. As a kid, I shrugged it off because, well, that's what siblings are for, right? But as adults, the difference between us has become glaring. I work a solid job, pay my bills, and take care of my own messes. But Alex has this way of bending reality to make it seem like the world owes him, like kindness and effort are just optional perks for people who happen to make him happy. He's charming, sure, but he's also exhausting and entitled, and I've learned the hard way that when he wants something, he'll guilt, manipulate, or argue until he gets it. So when my accident happened, I assumed my family would be at least reasonably supportive. Mom was sympathetic, but wrapped up in her own routines. Dad called twice, asked how I was doing, then disappeared into whatever project or hobby he was obsessed with. Alex, on the other hand, saw my crutches and my painfully slow recovery as an opportunity, though I didn't realize it at first. He came over one afternoon, grinning like he'd just had the best idea of his life, and sat down on my couch while I struggled to adjust the throw pillows behind my back. "Hey, little bro," he said, nudging my leg with one of my crutches like it was a toy. "I've got a proposition." I groaned internally. A proposition from Alex has never meant anything simple or fair. "Proposition?" I asked, wincing as I shifted to avoid putting too much weight on my leg. "Yeah, you see, I've got this ski trip booked to Switzerland next week. Totally non-refundable, so no take-backsies." He leaned back like he was revealing some epic, world-changing secret. "And well, I figured, since you're home all day anyway, you could watch my kids while I'm gone." I blinked. "Let me clarify. Alex has 2 kids, Liam, who's 8, and Sophie, who's 6, and he's never exactly been what you'd call hands-on. I mean, he can be a great dad, in short bursts, but most of the parenting falls on his wife, and even she can't always be bothered. Watching them for a week was not a small ask, especially for someone who could barely walk 3 feet without feeling like my leg was going to collapse. I opened my mouth, ready to decline politely, but Alex's grin was infuriatingly confident, and before I could say a word, he added, "I know it's a lot, but I figured it'd be good bonding time, right? You two have never really hung out one-on-one. Plus, think of it as your civic duty, little bro." I laughed, partly because I was incredulous, partly because I didn't want to look annoyed in front of him. "Sure," I said, the kind of easygoing sure that really meant, "You are going to regret ever asking me." I thought he'd take my laugh at face value, assume I was joking. He didn't. He clapped me on the shoulder, smiled, and said, "Awesome. I knew you'd see it my way. You'll be fine. I'll text you all the details." And with that, he left. I sat there for a long time after he walked out, staring at the crutches in the corner and thinking about what I'd just agreed to. I should have said no. I should have realized that Alex's idea of fine was never compatible with reality. But something in me, a mix of spite, exhaustion, and maybe just the lingering sense of obligation to my family, made me stick with it. I decided I'd take him up on his offer, but I also decided I wasn't going to do it his way. If he thought this was going to be effortless, he was in for a surprise. The first day he left was deceptively calm. Liam and Sophie were fine. A little wild, sure, but manageable. I shuffled around the house on my crutches, setting up their breakfasts, organizing toys, and pretending I wasn't silently dying every time I bent over to pick something up. I kept thinking about Alex, skiing in Switzerland, probably sipping some overpriced hot chocolate in a mountain lodge while I was stuck here, unable to bend my knee properly, chasing two kids who had energy levels that could power a small city. By the second day, the tension started to build. Liam had a tendency to ignore instructions, and Sophie was a tornado with a sugar rush. I found myself negotiating, cajoling, and eventually raising my voice, something I hate doing, but crutches limit my mobility and my patience. Every small task felt monumental. Making lunches, helping with homework, refereeing arguments over the dumbest things, and then trying to keep the house from descending into chaos. It was exhausting. I remember thinking, more than once, that Alex had no idea what he was asking. He was trading a week of effortless fun for a week of total chaos that I was living in his stead. And honestly, I felt a flicker of satisfaction in imagining his smug face if he ever realized just how intense it was. Then the text started. Alex, being Alex, had to check in multiple times a day, despite knowing full well that I could barely hobble to the kitchen without wanting to cry. The first message was simple. All good. I responded honestly. Yep, managing. Leg hurts, but the kids are fine. 2 hours later. Don't forget Sophie has ballet today. Make sure she's ready. I'll check in later. Then, Liam's lunch. He likes turkey sandwiches, not ham. And the pinnacle. Did you give them a snack at 10:30? Don't forget. You're my little lifesaver, Travis. I remember staring at my phone, one eyebrow raised, thinking, I am supposed to be the little lifesaver? I can barely stand, and you're halfway across Europe skiing down mountains. It was infuriating, but at the same time, I realized I had a choice. I could let this crush me, or I could lean into it. And oh, I was leaning. The next day, I made a decision. If Alex wanted to treat this as if I was just a convenient stopgap, I would treat it as the chance for him to learn a lesson. I started small. I rearranged some of the kids' schedules, mixing up snack times, doubling homework sessions, and, gently, enforcing chores that usually got skipped. Liam and Sophie were confused at first, but they eventually adapted. I could see the wheels turning in their heads as they realized I wasn't going to let them slide just because Daddy was gone. By midweek, I had the house running like a well-oiled machine, or at least as well-oiled as a house with two kids, one fractured leg, and a very determined babysitter could manage. I was exhausted, but there was a sense of quiet triumph in knowing that I was actually keeping everything together without losing my cool entirely. And I couldn't stop thinking about Alex. What would he say when he got back? Would he actually realize the effort it took to keep his life running in his absence? Or would he brush it off, thinking I was exaggerating? And that's where things stood when I got the first real hint that Alex had no idea what he was walking into. I just put Sophie down for a nap. Liam was quietly reading in the corner, and I was finally leaning back in my chair, grateful for a moment of peace, when my phone buzzed. It was a photo from Alex. A grinning selfie on a ski lift, captioned, "Best week ever. Don't work too hard while I'm gone." I stared at it, my jaw tight, and laughed, a little bitter, a little incredulous. I tapped out a reply. "Sure, Alex. Don't worry. I've got everything under control." I pressed send, then muttered under my breath, "Yeah, you'll see." By Thursday, the week had begun to feel like a marathon that never ended, and my leg was screaming in protest every time I moved more than a few steps. What started as manageable chaos had escalated into a full-blown circus, and I was starting to feel the full weight of Alex's assumption that I would somehow handle everything without complaint. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion anymore. It was the mental drain, the constant negotiation and compromise, and the subtle digs he'd left in his absence, like little traps that were slowly tightening around me. I had long since stopped expecting gratitude from Alex. I knew him well enough by now to understand that a simple thank you was too much to ask from someone who thought the world owed him his own personal paradise. But what I hadn't expected was the way he'd structured his absence to highlight how much he believed he was superior. His texts had grown more frequent, more micromanaging, and somehow more condescending with every hour. By Thursday morning, I was fielding messages like, "Make sure Liam doesn't watch TV past 4. He'll thank me later," and "Sophie really needs to work on sharing. I know it's hard, but try your best." And the kicker, "I'm sure you can handle it, little bro. You always step up." That little bro jab hit harder than anything else. I felt my jaw tighten every time I read it, because he was so casual in positioning himself as the responsible parent while implying I was just, well, a helper, someone who existed only to absorb the inconvenience of his life while he enjoyed the good parts. It was during lunch that the first real spark of rebellion flickered. Liam had refused to eat his sandwich unless it was cut diagonally, a minor request, but one I was too tired to cater to. Sophie, seeing him protest, immediately staged a tantrum over the same thing, and suddenly I was mediating two screaming kids, balancing a tray of food in one hand and leaning heavily on my crutches with the other. My patience was paper-thin. "Liam, Sophie, stop yelling." I snapped, and immediately felt guilty, but only briefly, because they were testing the limits of my patience in ways that I knew Alex would have brushed off or laughed at. "You're both getting your sandwiches the way I make them, or you don't get lunch at all." They stared at me, wide-eyed, and for a terrifying moment, I felt like I'd lost the war of wills. Then Liam muttered, "Daddy would do it right." The words hit me like a slap. I froze mid-motion, my crutches shifting beneath me. I wanted to tell him to stop, that Alex wasn't here, and that I was trying my best, but I couldn't. The pain wasn't just in my leg. It was in the realization that his father had conditioned him to think that only Alex's way mattered, and that I was inherently inferior. I swallowed the surge of anger and hurt and said as calmly as I could, "Well, I'm not Alex, and this is how we're doing it today. Deal with it." Sophie, not wanting to be left out, crossed her arms and pouted, "Daddy would never yell at us." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. This was the moment I realized how much Alex's absence had shifted the kids' expectations in a single week. They weren't just testing me, they were testing the boundaries Alex had set, boundaries that didn't include me. And yet, I knew that if I cracked, they'd keep pushing. My own anger simmered because I was beginning to see the broader picture. Alex didn't just trust me to manage his kids. He assumed I would bend to his world without complaint, and that was the real insult. Later that afternoon, while Sophie napped and Liam was supposed to be doing homework, I got a notification that made my stomach drop. It was a photo from Alex, sent just like before, but this one was different. It wasn't of him smiling on a ski lift. It was a group shot of his friends at a fancy mountain lodge, all in ski gear, laughing. And this is what got me. The caption read, "Liam and Sophie would be proud of me. Daddy's living his best life, while Travis holds down the fort. Hope he's surviving." I stared at the phone in disbelief, my fingers tightening around the device. The wink at the end was the icing on the cake. He was smug, satisfied, and utterly unaware of the emotional and physical toll this week had taken on me. My first instinct was to reply with some passive-aggressive jab, but I held back. I realized then that Alex's entitlement was almost absurd. He didn't see me as his brother. He saw me as a placeholder, a free childcare service, and the fact that he was flaunting his fun while I suffered was cruel in a way that stung more than any criticism could. By Friday, the exhaustion was physical, the kind that settled deep in my bones and made every movement feel like a mountain climb. The kids had started to push back harder. Liam refused to do his chores unless I specifically supervised him every second, and Sophie had started sneaking snacks from the pantry, giggling every time she thought I wasn't looking. The most painful part was the way they referred to Alex, almost reverently, as though he was some kind of flawless deity. Every mention of Daddy felt like a reminder of my inferiority, a constant whisper that no matter what I did, I could never measure up in their eyes. Then came the breaking point. I'd just finished making dinner, my leg throbbing, crutches propped against the counter, and the kids were unusually quiet. I didn't think much of it at first. Then Liam slipped something into my hand when I turned to get plates. It was a note. My stomach sank when I read it. It said, in sloppy, childish handwriting, "Daddy says if you try to make us do anything his way, We can tell him, and you'll be in trouble. Don't be mean, Travis. I felt like I'd been punched. At first, I thought maybe it was a joke. Maybe Liam had written it himself as some sort of prank. But then Sophie handed me her own note. Daddy says you can't make us do anything. He will be mad at you. Love, Sophie. My hands shook. I stared at the notes, reading and rereading them, my vision blurring with rage, disbelief, and hurt. My own brother had not just abandoned me. He had actively encouraged his children to betray any trust they had with me, to undermine me while I was at my weakest. The betrayal wasn't subtle, it was intentional. Alex had weaponized his absence, teaching his kids to disrespect me, to see me as the obstacle in their world rather than the caretaker who had been keeping everything from falling apart. I felt tears sting my eyes, a mix of anger and exhaustion. I wanted to storm out, to scream at Alex through some impossible channel, but I couldn't. My leg made every movement painful, and besides, I realized that screaming at him wouldn't do anything. This wasn't about yelling. It was about control, and Alex had built a system where he retained all of it, even in his absence. I sank into the chair, crutches falling to the floor, and let out a long, shuddering breath. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just angry. I was furious, humiliated, and, more importantly, resolute. This week had been a test of my patience, my endurance, and my ability to navigate a family dynamic that was toxic at its core. Alex had underestimated me in every possible way, assuming I'd quietly accept the chaos and pretend it was fun. He had no idea how calculated I could be when pushed to my limits. The kids watched me cautiously, sensing my shift in mood. Liam's eyes widened, and Sophie tilted her head, a small frown creasing her forehead. I forced a smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. I knew exactly what needed to happen next. This wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Alex had created the perfect storm, and I was about to turn it into a reckoning. I didn't say a word that night. I just sat there, thinking, planning, and letting the betrayal sink in fully. By the time I finally went to bed, I had a clear picture of what sure would really mean, and it wasn't going to be the kind of week Alex expected. I wasn't just surviving this week. I was gearing up to make sure he understood the full weight of his absence, the cost of underestimating me, and the consequences of treating me like a disposable part of his life. And for the first time that week, I felt a spark of satisfaction amidst the exhaustion. Because revenge, subtle or not, is always sweeter when it's patient, calculated, and completely inevitable. I just had to wait for Alex to come home to see it. Saturday morning arrived like a freight train I wasn't ready for. My leg ached in ways I didn't know were possible, my muscles were stiff, and my patience had officially evaporated. The betrayal from the notes Liam and Sophie had handed me the day before was still raw, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I'd spent the night thinking, planning, and replaying every moment of the week, analyzing every word, every expression, every tiny interaction. Alex had underestimated me at every turn, and now I understood exactly why he would pay for that. But before I could execute any plan, subtle, patient, and entirely satisfying, I had to survive the weekend. The house was quiet when I woke, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to breathe. Sophie's nap schedule had shifted slightly after the chaos of Thursday and Friday, and Liam had taken to hiding out in his room to avoid confrontation. It was eerie, almost peaceful, but I knew better than to trust it. Kids like Liam and Sophie, taught by an entitled parent to push boundaries, never stayed quiet for long. And sure enough, within 10 minutes, the first wave of conflict rolled in. Travis, Liam says he's hungry. Sophie's shrill voice echoed from the kitchen. My head throbbed at the sound. I hobbled out of my room, crutches clattering against the floor, and tried to maintain a calm expression. I had learned over the last week that my tone of voice could either diffuse or ignite a tantrum, and I was determined not to give them the satisfaction of chaos. I managed to get breakfast on the table with minimal incident, though it took nearly twice as long because I had to chase Liam around the kitchen, insist that Sophie sit down, and avoid stepping on every toy scattered across the floor. By the time we finished, I felt like I'd run a marathon, my body trembling with fatigue and my leg throbbing with protest. And then came the texts. Alex, oblivious to the chaos he had orchestrated, checked in again. Hope everyone's having a fun morning. Don't forget Liam has soccer practice today. He'll be so happy to see you there. I know you can handle it. I stared at the screen for a long time, my chest tightening with a mix of rage and exhaustion. The wink at the end was the final straw. He had no idea. No idea that I was exhausted beyond reason, that his kids were scheming against me, or that his absence had created an environment where I had been forced into a role I hadn't asked for. It was at that moment, sitting in my kitchen with Crutches propped awkwardly against the counter, that I hit rock bottom. Not physically, that had been happening all week, but emotionally. The betrayal, the condescension, the constant reminders that I was supposedly just helping out, while he lived his carefree, privileged life. It all collided in a moment of pure despair. I felt tears prick at my eyes, and for a long moment, I let them come. I didn't cry often, and I certainly didn't cry in front of Liam and Sophie, but sitting there in the quiet of the kitchen, I allowed myself a moment of weakness. I felt small, overlooked, and utterly unappreciated. My body ached, my mind raced, and my sense of self-worth felt like it had been ground into the floor by Alex's entitlement. But as I sat there, something shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was anger, or maybe it was the realization that I couldn't change Alex or the kids' perceptions of him, but I could change myself. I could reclaim control over my own life, even if Alex had spent his entire existence undermining it. Slowly, deliberately, I wiped my tears, squared my shoulders, and started thinking about how I could turn the situation around. Not with anger or shouting, but with strategy, patience, and quiet determination. The first step was reclaiming authority in the house. I started with small, seemingly insignificant adjustments that would have a ripple effect. Snack times, previously dictated by Wim and Alex's texts, were now consistent and non-negotiable. Chores, previously optional or ignored entirely, were enforced with calm but firm expectations. Liam and Sophie initially resisted, but I refused to back down. For the first time that week, they saw that I wasn't going to be a passive observer, and the fear and respect that began to grow in their eyes was intoxicating in its own way. By mid-morning, I had the kids engaged in a game I'd invented to help burn off energy. A mix of scavenger hunt and obstacle course designed to keep them moving and obeying instructions while staying safe in a house where I couldn't sprint or chase them the way I normally would. They were suspicious at first, but after a few rounds, their competitive sides took over, and they began cooperating. I marveled at the shift, realizing that authority didn't require shouting. It required structure, consistency, and a demonstration that I wasn't going to be undermined. The real turning point came when I found myself laughing. Not a bitter laugh, not a frustrated laugh, but a genuine, quiet laugh as Liam tripped over a cushion while trying to complete the scavenger hunt. Sophie, laughing at him, accidentally knocked over a vase, and instead of panicking, I calmly picked it up and made a joke about museum-quality skills. For the first time in days, the tension in the house lifted, if only slightly, and I realized something important. I was capable. I wasn't just surviving. I was adapting. I was building control and structure out of the chaos Alex had left behind. That afternoon, while Sophie napped and Liam was reading quietly, with clear boundaries enforced, I sat in the living room and reflected on the week. I had been forced into rock bottom by betrayal, entitlement, and exhaustion, but hitting that bottom had a strange, unexpected benefit: clarity. I could see Alex for what he really was. A man who had grown up believing the world owed him everything and who had projected that belief onto everyone around him, including his children. And I could see myself for what I was becoming. Not just the sibling who quietly did what was expected, but someone who could strategize, lead, and command respect, even in the most challenging circumstances. I started to plan my quiet ascent, the slow and methodical way I would reclaim power in this household, not through confrontation, but through mastery. I reorganized the kids' schedules, implemented a new reward system that rewarded cooperation and consistency, and even started small projects around the house to make things more efficient for the limited mobility I had. Every small victory, a completed chore, a successful meal, a peaceful moment, was a building block in my sense of self-worth. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: agency. And yet, beneath it all, a thread of anticipation ran through me. I knew Alex would return soon, and when he did, he would expect the same dynamic he had left behind: chaos, dependence, and blind compliance. What he didn't know was that I had been quietly reshaping the environment in his absence, subtly asserting control and preparing to reveal to him, in the most undeniable way, that I was no longer the passive little brother. The betrayal he had engineered had inadvertently empowered me to discover a strength I didn't know I possessed. By the time evening rolled around, Liam and Sophie were exhausted but cooperative, and I was physically drained in a way that felt almost victorious. I had survived the most intense week of my adult life, maintained my sanity, and begun the quiet work of rebuilding respect and structure in the household. The first real sense of accomplishment since the accident settled over me like a warm blanket. I had been at rock bottom, but from that low point, I could see a path forward, a path that didn't involve resentment, shouting, or caving to Alex's whims. I had the tools to turn the chaos he had left behind into something manageable, productive, and ultimately revealing. As I tucked Sophie in for the night and checked on Liam, who was quietly reading in bed, I felt a flicker of pride that warmed me in a way Alex could never take away. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving in a quiet, methodical way. And I knew, deep down, that when Alex returned, he was going to be shocked by the changes. Not just by how well the house had been managed, but by the realization that the brother he had underestimated was no longer willing to play the part he had assigned. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted but resolute, thinking about the week behind me and the week ahead. Revenge wasn't about instant gratification. It was about patience, timing, and precision. Alex had created the perfect storm, and I was quietly mastering it, reshaping it, and preparing to make him pay for every assumption, every condescending text, and every ounce of entitlement he had displayed. By the time I finally crawled into bed, I felt the first genuine sense of hope in days. I wasn't just a caretaker for his children. I was a force to be reckoned with, quietly powerful in ways Alex couldn't even imagine. The fall had been devastating, but the rise, I realized, would be inevitable. And somewhere deep in the back of my mind, I knew that when Alex returned, he wouldn't just see a well-run household. He would see the brother he had underestimated, the one he had dismissed, and he would finally understand that sure had never meant what he thought it did. Sunday arrived with a deceptive calm that made the week's chaos feel like a distant memory, but I knew better. The quiet was a trap, a lull before the storm, and I had learned in the past few days that in a house with 2 kids, a fractured leg, and an entitled brother, quiet meant opportunity. I'd spent the week being pushed, tested, and undermined, and I had emerged bruised but resolute, quietly rebuilding control and authority over the household. Now it was time to turn that authority into leverage, to begin setting the stage for a payoff Alex would never see coming. I woke early, before the kids, and slowly shuffled to the kitchen, leaning heavily on my crutches, my legs still throbbing from the week's physical strain. I made a mental checklist: breakfast, a quick inspection of the house to ensure nothing was out of place, and a review of the plans I had been quietly formulating since Thursday. Each small victory over the past days had been a building block, and now I was ready to start stacking them in a way that would maximize impact. The first step was knowledge. Over the past few days, I had observed the kids closely, noting every pattern, every weakness, every point where Alex's influence could be undermined subtly. Liam's obsession with fairness could be leveraged, as could Sophie's tendency to exaggerate for attention. Both of them had been trained to see me as weaker, less competent, a temporary figure in their lives. But that perception was about to shift dramatically. I had already begun enforcing structure, but now I needed to embed consequences and rewards in ways that would shape behavior long-term and create the illusion that the kids were participating willingly in a system I had designed. I started with the morning routine. Normally, Alex would text reminders, check on snack times, and micromanage the kids' schedules. This Sunday, I decided to seize control completely. I created a visual schedule on the fridge, carefully color-coded, with clearly defined blocks for meals, playtime, reading, and chores. I included fun elements, a reward system with stickers and small privileges, but it was rigorous, consistent, and non-negotiable. I had discovered that kids respond to structure if it's presented as a game, and I intended to exploit that fully. When the kids emerged, bleary-eyed but curious, I presented the new system with a smile that I hoped hid my growing sense of anticipation. Good morning, team. Today we're going to try something new. We have a schedule, and we're going to follow it together. If we do a great job, there are stickers, and stickers mean prizes. Their eyes lit up immediately, but I could see the skepticism in Liam's gaze. He was trying to figure out if this was a trap or just another attempt to enforce rules he didn't respect. I let him stew in that doubt for a moment before adding, "And if we follow it well, maybe Daddy will be proud of you too when he comes back." That little line was the key. I planted the seed of Alex's imagined authority while fully controlling the reality of the house. The day unfolded with remarkable efficiency. Meals were eaten without complaint, chores were completed, and I even managed a short outdoor adventure in the backyard that burned off some of their energy. All the while, I kept mental notes of behavior patterns, lapses in obedience, and small victories. Every interaction was a puzzle piece I could later use to shape Alex's perception of the week he had missed. By mid-afternoon, I felt an unfamiliar sense of power. Not the brash, loud kind of authority that Alex wielded, but the quiet, methodical kind that comes from preparation, observation, and understanding. It was during this quiet that I began forming my plan for the ultimate reveal. I knew Alex would expect chaos, exhaustion, and frustration. He would anticipate grumbling children and a stressed-out brother who had barely survived the week. What he wouldn't expect was the precision with which I had rebuilt order in his absence. I imagined his reaction when he returned to a clean, organized house. Children who were well-behaved, competent, and even subtly loyal to me. And the subtle but undeniable signs that I had orchestrated the entire week with skill he hadn't credited me with. The setup also involved subtle psychological preparation. I began introducing small choices to the kids that made them feel empowered but also aligned with the structure I had imposed. Liam, for instance, got to choose which chores he wanted to tackle first, but the list of options was carefully curated. Sophie was allowed to assign herself reading or creative tasks, but I monitored compliance and gently reinforced boundaries. The result was that by the time Alex returned, the kids would appear cooperative and happy, seemingly thriving under his absence. Yet every step they took had been guided by me. I also used this time to rehearse my responses to Alex. I anticipated his complaints, his questions, and his subtle jabs. He would likely remark on the efficiency, the order, and the way the kids had adjusted, trying to take credit or imply that it was nothing extraordinary. I practiced phrases, calmly neutral but firm, that would underscore my control without revealing the depth of my planning. Every word, every tone, every small facial expression became part of the preparation. Meanwhile, I didn't neglect the physical aspect. Despite my fractured leg, I began small exercises at home to strengthen mobility and endurance. If Alex saw me hobbling, he would assume weakness. If he saw me moving with confidence and agility, still limited but competent, he would be forced to reconcile his assumptions with reality. The physical component was crucial. It wasn't just about perception. It was about showing that I had survived, adapted, and mastered the challenge he thought would break me. By evening, I began the final touches on the setup. I prepared a series of small, noticeable improvements around the house, cleaning areas Alex had never bothered to maintain, organizing his children's clothes and toys in a way that made daily life smoother, and even baking a simple treat for the kids, something Alex would usually overlook or delegate. The idea was simple. Make the house appear effortlessly perfect while subtly highlighting the labor, skill, and patience I had invested. I wanted Alex to see the results and feel a pang of guilt, confusion, and all at once. The final element of the setup involved information control. Over the week, I had noted every habit, every preference, and every minor quirk of the kids and Alex himself. I had created mental dossiers on behavior triggers, preferred routines, and likely reactions. By timing small revelations, for instance, revealing that Sophie had actually completed her entire reading assignment without complaint, or that Liam had followed the chore schedule perfectly, I could build a pattern of subtle, undeniable evidence that I had not just survived the week, but had done so with precision, strategy, and patience. As the evening drew to a close, I sat back in my chair, exhausted but exhilarated. The plan was in motion, and every piece was falling into place. Alex's return was inevitable, and I could already picture his shock as he walked into a house that appeared idyllic. Children who were orderly and happy, and a brother who had not just survived, but quietly mastered every challenge he had left behind. The thought brought a slow, satisfied smile to my face. I wasn't just preparing for revenge. I was preparing for revelation, showing Alex, in a way he could neither deny nor deflect, the consequences of his entitlement and the underestimated capabilities of the brother he had assumed would simply hold the fort. It was meticulous, patient, and perfectly calculated, the kind of setup that demanded attention, respect, and, eventually, reflection on his part. That night, as I finally crawled into bed, I felt a rare sense of peace. The storm had passed, the groundwork was laid, and the house, for the first time all week, felt like mine, not in the sense of ownership, but in the sense of mastery. I had risen from rock bottom, rebuilt control, and quietly engineered a situation where Alex's assumptions would be shattered, and I would finally have the satisfaction of seeing him confront the results of his own negligence. Monday morning came with a strange kind of electricity. I had spent the weekend meticulously orchestrating the environment, establishing routines, and subtly shaping the kids' behavior so that by the time Alex walked back through the door, the illusion of effortless perfection would mask the labor, strategy, and control I had exercised over every detail. The house smelled faintly of baked bread and clean laundry. The kitchen counters gleamed, and the children were dressed, fed, and engaged in activities that reflected structure, discipline, and joy, at least on the surface. The difference was that this was not the world Alex had created. It was the one I had engineered, quietly, deliberately, and without fanfare, waiting for the moment of reveal. I positioned myself in the living room, Crutches leaned against the side of the couch, my legs still throbbing but manageable. Liam was reading quietly at the small table I had set up, and Sophie was painting in her art corner, carefully following the schedule I had imposed. The calm before the storm made my stomach tighten with anticipation. I had rehearsed this moment countless times in my head, imagining every possible reaction Alex could have, every possible attempt he might make to reclaim authority, and every subtle way I could respond to maximize his discomfort. The doorbell rang, echoing through the house like a starting gun. I took a deep breath, feeling the satisfaction of anticipation wash over me. The week of chaos, frustration, and betrayal had been transformed into a quiet, calculated stage. I swung open the door to reveal Alex, his arms loaded with luggage, his ski jacket disheveled but pristine, his grin confident and self-assured, completely unprepared for what awaited him. "Travis, hey, how's it going?" he said brightly, dropping the bags onto the floor without a second thought. He glanced past me, expecting the scene of chaos that usually greeted him, and froze. His eyes widened as he took in the immaculate kitchen, the neatly arranged toys, the children calmly engaged in their activities, and the serene but subtly commanding presence of his brother leaning against the couch. What's going on here?" His voice carried the familiar mix of disbelief and growing suspicion. I smiled, leaning lightly on my crutches. "Morning, Alex. Everything's under control. Kids had a great breakfast, chores are done, and we've even managed some educational activities." Sophie finished her reading assignment, and Liam completed his chore chart perfectly. Alex blinked, his confident grin faltering as he took in the tableau. He looked at Liam, who nodded politely, then at Sophie, who waved without missing a beat in her painting. Wait, you actually got them too? How? His tone shifted from surprise to incredulity, then to an almost defensive disbelief. I shrugged casually. Consistency, structure, patience. It's amazing what a little attention and planning can do. Funny how some people assume things happen automatically just because they walk away. I let the words hang in the air, calm, measured, but laced with a subtle bite. Alex's jaw tightened. I mean, they're my kids. I do this all the time. How did you? They usually. He faltered, clearly scrambling to rationalize what he was seeing. I interrupted gently, with a tone of careful neutrality. You left for a week and assumed everything would collapse without you. I took it as a challenge. Turns out, a little guidance goes a long way. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw hesitation in his movements. He glanced toward the fridge and noticed the color-coded schedule and sticker chart I had implemented. He looked back at me, incredulous, as if trying to find a flaw in the facade, and then at the children, who were smiling, cooperating, and clearly content. His face shifted from confusion to the beginnings of guilt. The first strike of the reveal came when Liam spoke up, his voice calm and precise. Daddy, Travis made sure I finished all my homework this week, even the extra problems you usually skip. And he made it kind of fun, too. Liam's words weren't just informational. They carried a subtle undercurrent of pride, the kind of statement that highlighted my authority while showing the children's acknowledgement of it. Sophie, with a small, polite smile, added, and I didn't get in trouble once, but I followed all the rules Travis made, and it worked really well. I liked it. Alex's expression shifted again, from incredulity to a flicker of discomfort. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped, clearly struggling to process the fact that his children had behaved better under my guidance than they often did under his own hands-on supervision. I stepped forward, still calm, measured, with just the right hint of satisfaction in my voice. It's amazing what happens when you pay attention, provide structure, and treat people, kids or adults, with respect and consistency. Funny how that works, huh? I let the question linger in the air, knowing full well the sting it would carry for him. Alex shuffled his feet, finally muttering, I didn't. I mean, you just. His usual charm and confidence had dissolved entirely, replaced by the stunned realization that he had underestimated not just the children's capabilities under my guidance, but my own. I leaned back against the couch, Crutches balanced carefully, and let the tension build. I survived the week, Alex. I didn't just survive, I thrived. The kids are happy, the house is organized, and no one fell apart in the process. I guess that's what happens when you actually consider what it takes to make things work, instead of assuming everything revolves around you. He looked at me, searching for some rebuttal, some excuse, but none came. He opened his mouth several times, and each attempt faltered. He had nothing. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very brother who had left me in chaos, assuming entitlement would shield him from consequence, was now confronted with evidence of his own negligence and my competence, calm and undeniable. Then came the final, subtle strike. I gestured toward the children. By the way, they've actually started following the rules without me even hovering over them. They're learning, cooperating, and thriving. You might even say I managed to teach them a thing or two while you were away. Alex's face went pale. He glanced at the schedule, the chore chart, the clean counters, the peaceful children, and then back at me. The weight of realization hit him. He hadn't just underestimated me. He had misjudged the very core of what it meant to lead, guide, and take responsibility. And now, staring at the results of his own assumptions, he had no choice but to acknowledge it. For a long moment, there was silence. The children were quiet, watching the exchange, sensing the tension but also understanding, perhaps instinctively, that I had orchestrated every detail. Alex shifted uncomfortably, then muttered, almost under his breath, I didn't expect this. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile, careful not to overplay it. No, you didn't. And that's the point. He looked around the house, the children, the schedule, and finally, at me. I guess I owe you an apology. His voice was hesitant, unsure, and lacking the usual confidence with which he would normally demand compliance. I shook my head. You don't owe me anything, Alex. You owe yourself the lesson that assuming others will just fill your gaps without effort or respect doesn't work. Maybe next time, you'll think twice before you leave your responsibilities entirely to someone else. Alex opened his mouth again, but I could see it in his eyes. He had nothing to add. He had been stripped of authority, confronted with undeniable evidence of my competence, and forced to reckon with the weak he had taken for granted. His smug, entitled confidence had crumbled, replaced by humility, guilt, and a grudging respect he couldn't voice fully. The children, sensing the tension but also the shift in dynamics, returned to their activities. Liam smiled at me, small but knowing, and Sophie gave a subtle nod of approval. In that moment, I realized that my revenge had worked not just on Alex, but on the environment he had cultivated. The children now recognized my authority, the house ran smoothly, and I had proven, quietly but completely, that competence, patience, and strategy matter far more than entitlement. By the time Alex finally retreated to his luggage, still processing the collapse of his assumptions, I sank into the couch, Crutches balanced carefully, and allowed myself a deep breath. The week of chaos, betrayal, and exhaustion had culminated not in shouting, confrontation, or dramatic spectacle, but in calm, precise, undeniable demonstration. Every step had been deliberate, every detail orchestrated, and every ounce of patience had paid off. For the first time all week, I felt fully in control. Alex had returned expecting dominance, disorder, and reliance, and instead found structure, obedience, and mastery. He had been forced to witness, without a word of argument, the consequences of his entitlement and the quiet power of a brother he had dismissed. And as I watched him stumble through the house, trying to reclaim a sense of authority that no longer existed, I felt a profound satisfaction, a quiet, deep, and lasting triumph. I had endured, adapted, and executed my plan flawlessly, turning chaos into order, betrayal into strategy, and underestimation into undeniable respect. I leaned back, eyes on the kids, a small smile playing on my lips, and thought to myself, with a calm certainty I had never felt before, this was exactly what sure meant. Hi Reddit, I'm Carter, 28, and I've been dealing with my family's passive-aggressive nonsense for as long as I can remember. But this past weekend took things to a level I didn't think was even possible. Honestly, I still can't believe how it all unfolded, and I just need to get it off my chest because even writing it makes my blood pressure spike. So, here's the setup. My cousin, Melissa, who's technically only a year older than me, but somehow always managed to make me feel like the unwanted younger cousin, got engaged. Now, Melissa and I have had a complicated relationship. Growing up, she was the golden child, though nobody in the family ever said it outright. They just made sure she got the bigger slice of everything. Birthdays, holidays, attention, praise, even college tuition. Me? I quietly did my thing, avoided the spotlight, and hoped the unfairness would eventually feel less sharp. Spoiler, it never did. A week before her engagement party, my mom casually mentioned that it was just going to be a small, casual gathering at Melissa's fiancé's parents' house. She didn't even use the word invitation or anything formal. She just said it in passing, like she expected me to shrug and move on. I asked her if I was invited, and she laughed this weird little laugh, half nervous, half dismissive, and said, "Well, we'll see if there's room. You can come by if you want, I guess." That should have been my first red flag. I mean, I've been to every family event I was actually invited to for the past 28 years. It was unusual for them to leave me in limbo like that. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself, maybe they just miscommunicated, maybe it's not that serious. But then my sister, who is usually the most oblivious of the bunch, dropped a comment like it was nothing. "Oh, it's just a casual gathering." Honestly, I don't know why Carter would even care. I froze. Did they just completely dismiss me? It wasn't just that I might not get a fancy seat at the table or a glass of champagne. It was the principle of it. The thought that they would quietly let me feel like I didn't matter at all. So, Naturally, I did what any reasonable, slightly stubborn person would do. I decided to go anyway. I mean, if this was their attempt to make me feel excluded, I wasn't going to sit at home sulking. I wanted to see what exactly they were doing behind that polished, smiling facade, and maybe, just maybe, I'd make sure they couldn't ignore me entirely. I arrived early. The driveway was already dotted with luxury cars that none of us ever drive in real life. Melissa's fiancé, Jared, was leaning against his truck, casually texting, looking like he owned the universe. I waved, but no one waved back. No one, including Melissa. That tiny sting hit harder than I expected. I reminded myself to breathe and told myself that I wasn't here for a warm welcome. I was here to observe, to witness the way my family acted when they thought I wasn't paying attention. The house itself was immaculate. Perfectly manicured lawn, soft jazz playing somewhere inside. The kind of scent in the air that tells you this is a meticulously staged event. And it was, I realized, almost immediately. Every smile was curated. Every conversation was choreographed. I hovered near the edge of the gathering, watching the way my family greeted each other, the subtle way they tried to remind me I wasn't supposed to be part of the picture. My Aunt Marge, who never misses an opportunity to subtly humiliate me, was loudly discussing the catering, and when she noticed me, her smile froze just a fraction of a second before she waved politely. That second was enough. I knew exactly what she was thinking. What are you doing here? Then Melissa appeared, glowing in her engagement dress, talking to Jared like they were the only people in the room. She didn't glance in my direction once. I caught her fiancé, Jared, noticing me at the periphery, and for a moment, I thought maybe he'd introduce me. But no, he just gave me that half smile that says, "I see you, but you're not important." I felt my jaw tighten. The rational part of me knew I could leave and still preserve my dignity. The slightly irrational, simmering part of me wanted to stay just to see how far they'd push. It was somewhere around this point, 20 minutes into my self-appointed stakeout, that I noticed something odd. Melissa's fiancé, standing near the coat rack where I had hung mine, leaned toward me ever so slightly when she thought I wasn't looking. I froze mid-step. My mind instantly went to worst-case scenarios. Was she trying to plant something in my coat? A prank? A gift? Something worse? I couldn't tell, but the sneaky, calculating glance she gave me made it clear that she was doing something underhanded. And here's the thing, my instincts rarely lie. I didn't react immediately. I just let my eyes track her movements, pretending to tie my shoe, keeping my gaze subtle but persistent. 20 seconds later, she moved away, and I leaned toward my coat. I checked, nothing there. Not yet, anyway, but my blood was already boiling. This wasn't a harmless oversight. This was deliberate. And that's when I realized that this evening wasn't going to be just awkward family drama. It was going to be a chess game, and I wasn't about to sit back and lose without a fight. As I positioned myself closer to the living room, I started piecing together the patterns. Who was whispering to whom? Who was giving me those small, dismissive glances? Who was enjoying the spectacle of me being invisible? It was all laid out in front of me like a play, and the thought of letting them have the upper hand made my stomach twist with a mix of anger and anticipation. I knew one thing for certain. By the end of this night, either they'd regret treating me like I didn't exist, or I'd have to leave feeling completely powerless. And I refused to feel powerless, not this time. And that's when the first spark hit. A small, almost innocuous comment from my aunt, so quiet that she thought I didn't hear it, made the entire room shift. "I guess some people just don't know when to stay home," she murmured, her eyes glancing toward me while pretending to fuss over a tray of hors d'oeuvres. My hand curled slightly around the edge of the table, and I realized then that the night I expected to be passive and observant was about to escalate into something much messier. I glanced around, noting every subtle smirk, every whisper, every glance in my direction. My pulse was racing, but there was also this strange sense of satisfaction. I was here, fully present, fully aware of every underhanded thing happening around me. And if anyone thought I was going to leave quietly, they were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. 20 minutes into the party, with my coat still firmly in my possession and my mind racing, I noticed a shift. Melissa's fiancé tried the same move again, leaning subtly toward my coat as if I wouldn't notice. Only this time, I did notice. And that's when I realized that things were about to get interesting. Very interesting. I stayed planted near the edge of the living room, my mind racing as I watched the family interact around me. Every conversation was like a calculated performance, and somehow, I was supposed to feel invisible despite being physically present. My mom, who usually tries to appear neutral in front of guests, was leaning in toward Melissa, laughing at something Jared said, completely oblivious, or perhaps deliberately ignoring the fact that I was standing only a few feet away. It wasn't subtle this time. I was the only one left out of jokes, the only one not invited into whispered conversations, the only one whose presence seemed to irritate everyone without anyone feeling the need to acknowledge it. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just caught up in the excitement. Maybe I was overthinking. But it became impossible to ignore when Aunt Marge started in with what I can only describe as a full-on performance of exclusion. She made a show of offering hors d'oeuvres to everyone around her while passing directly in front of me and pretending I wasn't there. She didn't even glance in my direction. The deliberate nature of it made my chest tighten, and my fingers clutched the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. Melissa herself, radiant and smiling at everyone else, completely ignored me. She didn't even glance my way. My stomach twisted. I wanted to confront her, to ask, why am I not worthy of a glance? But I held myself back, reminding myself that my goal wasn't to lash out in the moment. It was to observe, to see how far this could go. And, honestly, I had a nagging sense that this wasn't just harmless oversight anymore. Then came the subtle digs. They started small, almost playful on the surface. My cousin's younger brother, who has always had a slightly cruel streak, made a comment about how some people aren't really made for parties like this. He laughed lightly, looking toward the rest of the family, and everyone smiled along as if they were all in on a private joke. My heart sank. I could feel every word like a tiny knife, and the most painful part was the laughter around me that I wasn't allowed to share in. Melissa's fiancé, Jared, seemed to sense the tension. But instead of diffusing it, he leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, and watched me with that same faint smirk. I could practically hear him thinking, interesting, this one actually noticed. That alone made my blood boil. There's something about being looked at like you're a curiosity or a minor obstacle, like your discomfort is amusing, that brings a strange mix of rage and helplessness. As the night progressed, the exclusion intensified. When the drinks were passed, I got a barely there nod from my mom while she offered full glasses to everyone else. When desserts were served, Melissa made a show of giving everyone a slice before noticing me, then holding up her hands in mock apology. "Oh, we didn't save any for you. Sorry." Her tone was too cheerful to be genuine. It was mocking, and everyone around her laughed, including my mom, who even added, "You'll just have to settle for leftovers if you want." By this point, my anger was simmering just under the surface. I reminded myself that I wasn't here to explode yet. I was here to see, to fully absorb what they were doing. But the mental gymnastics required to remain calm were exhausting. Every laugh, every glance, every tiny exclusion felt like a deliberate attack. I could feel my jaw tightening, my stomach twisting into knots, and my palms sweating. And then it happened. The betrayal that flipped the room upside down in a single moment. I had noticed Jared glancing at me occasionally, pretending not to, and at first I chalked it up to passive observation. But 20 minutes into the party, as I reached for my coat to check something, he deliberately moved it to a different hook, not in front of anyone else, just in a way that made it slightly more inconvenient for me. That's when my gut sank. That's when I realized it wasn't just Melissa, it wasn't just my aunt, or even my mother. This was coordinated. Jared, the person who wasn't even family yet, was actively participating in making me feel unwelcome. My hands clenched into fists as I felt the weight of it. I stepped back and watched him as he made his way across the room, chatting lightly with other guests, completely unaware, or pretending to be, that I had noticed. And then Melissa approached, holding a glass of champagne for Jared, and whispered something in his ear with a smile that was equal parts conspiratorial and smug. They didn't realize I could see them. I wasn't supposed to, but I did. And in that moment, a shift happened inside me. The disbelief and hurt morphed into something sharper, something that demanded action. And then the ultimate betrayal, my own mother. I had been looking for some sign that she might intervene, even quietly, to acknowledge that I was being treated unfairly. But no. Instead, she leaned over to Aunt Marge and whispered something with a smile. Whatever she said, it made Marge laugh, a loud, full laugh that seemed to echo across the room, deliberately excluding me. My chest tightened so much that I felt like I couldn't breathe. I wanted to speak up, to call her out right there, but instead I froze, letting the weight of what was happening fully settle. My own mother had not only allowed this, but seemed actively complicit. It was in that moment, standing there, absorbing the full scope of exclusion, favoritism, and passive-aggressive cruelty, that I realized the party had shifted from a casual gathering into a display of power and humiliation. Melissa and Jared weren't just ignoring me. They were actively testing boundaries, making me question my place in the family, and enjoying every second of it. And my family, the people who were supposed to protect me, or at least treat me with basic decency, were gleefully complicit. I tried to focus on my own composure, to remind myself that this wasn't just about feelings anymore. I had to stay alert. Every interaction was a clue, every smile a potential trap, every word a test of my patience. I realized I was at a crossroads. I could continue observing silently, letting them pile humiliation on top of humiliation, or I could start taking steps to reclaim my agency. The thought of doing nothing made my stomach turn with a mix of frustration and fear. And then, the moment that broke me in a different way, the moment when my sense of reality cracked. Melissa's fiancé, Jared, thought I wasn't looking again. This time, he reached toward my coat with something small in his hand. I could see it clearly out of the corner of my eye. A tiny, folded piece of paper or maybe a card, something he intended to slip inside without me noticing. My mind raced. Was it a note? Was it something worse? I couldn't tell, but the deliberate secrecy of it sent a shiver down my spine. I realized, in that split second, that the night wasn't going to end politely. Something was about to explode, and I was standing at the epicenter. I didn't move immediately. I let the seconds stretch, pretending to check my phone while my gaze stayed locked on his movements. My heart was hammering, my thoughts were spinning, and the anger that had been building quietly for months finally surged to the surface. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was betrayal. Coordinated, intentional, cruel. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that once I acted, nothing would ever be the same again. 20 minutes later, chaos was about to break out. I could feel it in my bones. The tension, the exclusion, the subtle sabotage. All of it was converging toward a single point, and I was no longer a passive observer. I was ready to intervene. The chaos that erupted that night didn't hit me like a single, explosive moment. It was subtle at first, like a slow crack forming in the foundation beneath me. The piece of paper Jared had tried to slip into my coat fell to the floor instead, whether by accident or by design. I couldn't tell, but the effect was immediate. Melissa noticed it first, and when she bent down to pick it up, her expression was a mix of irritation and disbelief, like the universe had dared to inconvenience her. I could feel the tension around me snap. The entire room shifted, the carefully constructed veneer of casual elegance breaking for the first time. Aunt Marge's laughter, which had felt so triumphant just minutes earlier, froze mid-chuckle as she realized my eyes were locked on her. The tiny smirk on Jared's face faltered slightly, and Melissa, oblivious or perhaps trying to maintain control, straightened herself as if nothing had happened. But the subtle tremor in her posture betrayed her. This was my moment, though I didn't act immediately. I stayed still, letting the small victories of observation settle in my chest. For the first time that night, I felt a flicker of clarity. I wasn't powerless here. I didn't have to leave or pretend everything was fine. I could respond, strategically, deliberately. But the aftermath of that moment wasn't just empowerment, it was a crash. Being in that room, surrounded by people who had spent years subtly undermining me, exhausted me emotionally and physically. My chest felt tight. My stomach churned with a mix of rage and humiliation. And by the time the party began winding down, I was ready to collapse. I went outside, escaping the curated perfection of the living room, and leaned against the cold wall of the house. The night air hit my face, sharp and refreshing, and I took long, deep breaths, trying to untangle the jumble of emotions twisting through me. That's when the reality hit me. This wasn't just about a party. This was my life, or at least the version of it that my family had tried to define for me for decades. Their favoritism, their passive-aggressive comments, their constant need to remind me that I was less than or unimportant. All of it came rushing back in a wave of painful memories. I thought about every birthday where my gifts were ignored, every holiday where my achievements were minimized, every time I had been made to feel invisible for someone else's convenience. And the anger, which had been simmering quietly for years, surged. I felt, quite literally, at rock bottom. I sat there on the curb, letting the cold seep into my jeans, staring at the glowing windows of the party. I wasn't invited. I wasn't wanted. And yet, here I was, fully aware of the lengths they would go to humiliate me and fully powerless in that moment to change anything. It was bitter, crushing, and relentless. My thoughts spiraled. Why do I keep putting myself through this? Why do I care so much about people who don't care about me? But even in that low, suffocating place, a spark of something else started to form. A small, stubborn ember that refused to be snuffed out. I realized that their cruelty only had as much power as I gave it. The realization wasn't immediate or glamorous. It was slow, creeping in between the sting of betrayal and the ache of exclusion. I began to think about my life beyond that house, beyond the expectations and judgments of people who had never truly seen me. I thought about the years I had spent quietly building my own skills, pursuing my own goals, quietly excelling in areas that didn't involve family approval. The next few days were a haze. I didn't call anyone, didn't respond to texts, and spent most of my time reflecting, journaling, and thinking. It was hard to sit with the anger without letting it consume me, but I started to see patterns. I recognized the toxicity that had threaded through my family for as long as I could remember, and I realized something crucial. Their approval wasn't necessary. Their validation wasn't a requirement for my happiness, my success, or my sense of self-worth. That realization was both liberating and terrifying. I began making small changes immediately. First, I took control of my personal space. I organized my apartment in a way that felt deliberate and empowering, creating an environment that reflected me rather than accommodating anyone else's expectations. I reconnected with friends who had always supported me quietly in the background, people who had never judged me for being different or for quietly enduring family nonsense. Those reconnections reminded me that the world beyond my family wasn't just a backup plan. It was a place where I could thrive. Then I shifted my focus to my career. For years, I had been quietly building skills and connections, saving money, and investing in projects I cared about, but had always felt overshadowed in my family's eyes. I began dedicating time and energy to those projects in a more intentional way, not for recognition from them, but for my own sense of accomplishment. I started networking strategically, polishing my resume, reaching out to mentors, and even taking on small public-facing projects that allowed me to establish credibility in my field. The more I invested in myself, the stronger I felt. Emotionally, I was rebuilding too. I set boundaries with my family, small at first, like not answering every message immediately and declining invitations that felt performative rather than meaningful. I refused to engage in conversations where I was being subtly demeaned or excluded. Each boundary reinforced my sense of self-respect. The act of asserting my right to space, to dignity, to control over my own life became addictive in the best way. I was finally reclaiming power that had been quietly stripped away over decades. The quietest but most profound part of this period was the internal transformation. I began noticing subtle changes in how I felt about myself. The anger and humiliation of that night at Melissa's engagement weren't gone. They never fully would be, but they had transformed into a driving force. I was no longer just reacting to my family's behavior. I was anticipating it, understanding it, and using it to shape my decisions. Where once I had internalized their favoritism and subtle cruelty, now I saw it as information. Their attempts to exclude, belittle, or manipulate me became clues for how to navigate interactions and protect my own interests. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fear that had been part of my life for as long as I could remember, the fear of being left out, ignored, or dismissed, started to fade. I felt the beginnings of a quiet confidence, a sense of agency that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I was no longer just surviving their manipulations. I was learning to thrive in spite of them. By the end of the first month after that engagement party, I was in a very different place. I wasn't celebrating with Melissa or attending any more casual gatherings designed to make me feel small. Instead, I was celebrating small victories of my own, a project at work that earned recognition, a dinner with friends where I felt genuinely valued, a personal milestone in a hobby I had neglected for too long. Each step forward reinforced that my self-worth wasn't contingent on anyone in my family. Even more importantly, I began planning, not impulsively, not out of spite, but carefully, deliberately. I started thinking about ways to confront the unfairness of the past without stooping to petty revenge, ways to reclaim not just my dignity, but my power in spaces my family thought they controlled. I realized that true influence didn't come from proving them wrong in their eyes. It came from quietly building a life where their opinions no longer mattered. The thought of that future, one where I could walk into any room with confidence, knowing I didn't need their approval, filled me with a sense of calm determination I hadn't felt in years. And yet, beneath all of this, a flicker of anticipation remained. Because while I was rebuilding, growing, and quietly claiming my worth, I also knew that what had happened at that party, Melissa's exclusion, Jared's deliberate sabotage, Aunt Marge's triumphant glee, and even my mother's complicity, wasn't something I could just forget. I could grow beyond it, yes, but the memory was still there, sharp and precise, and I had no intention of letting it dictate my present. In fact, I realized something profound. Their cruelty had given me something they couldn't take away: clarity. I could see exactly who was capable of manipulation, who thrived on power and exclusion, and who would never change. And with that clarity came strategy. With that clarity came a plan, not one fueled by rash emotion, but by careful observation, deliberate action, and the kind of quiet, unstoppable persistence that builds over time. By the time I felt truly ready to re-enter their orbit, even cautiously, I was no longer the same Carter who had walked into that casual gathering months earlier. I had fallen to rock bottom, yes, but in that fall, I had found something they could never touch, a sense of self that was independent, resilient, and quietly formidable. And that's when the next phase began, not the confrontation itself, not the chaos yet, but the slow, deliberate work of reclaiming power. The part where I would finally begin to show that I was no longer someone to be excluded, dismissed, or humiliated. The part where I would rise, quietly but unmistakably, toward a reckoning that would leave no one in doubt of who I had become. After weeks of reflection and quiet rebuilding, I realized something fundamental. Reacting impulsively wouldn't serve me. I had to approach this carefully. Every slight, every exclusion, every deliberate snub had been a test of my boundaries and my patience. And I had passed the first test by surviving it, by refusing to let their cruelty dictate my emotions entirely. But the next phase required more than endurance. It required precision, planning, a strategy that would ensure I reclaimed not just my dignity, but a sense of power they had never imagined I could wield. The first thing I did was assess the battlefield. Not literally, of course, but metaphorically. I revisited every detail of that engagement party, the subtle glances, the deliberate gestures, the small betrayals. I made notes, not in a notebook, but in my head. I cataloged who had been complicit, who had instigated, who had participated in the subtle cruelty, and who had merely laughed along. The distinctions mattered. I realized that my mother, for instance, wasn't an instigator by nature. She was a willing participant when it suited her, and she thrived on approval from other family members. Aunt Marge, on the other hand, was the kind of person who delighted in humiliation as a form of sport. Melissa was predictable. She wanted the attention, the admiration, the applause, and she had no patience for anyone who challenged her perceived supremacy. Jared was ambitious and manipulative, eager to assert dominance and test boundaries in a way that made him look clever while I looked like a nuisance. Once I had mapped out the players, I shifted my focus to opportunities. The key to any successful plan, I realized, was timing. I needed an event, a moment, or a situation where everyone would reveal themselves as they truly were. The engagement party had been the opening act, a trial run in subtle cruelty. But there had to be a stage big enough for the main performance, one that would allow me to assert my presence without giving anyone an easy excuse to dismiss me. I started attending family gatherings again, but cautiously. Not as a participant, not as someone seeking validation, but as an observer. I went to dinners, casual meetups, and even the obligatory brunches, and I watched. I noted seating arrangements, patterns in conversation, and who tended to dominate discussions. I paid attention to what people valued, what they bragged about, what they flaunted, what they wanted recognition for. This was my intelligence gathering phase. By the time I was ready to act, I would know exactly where to strike and how to maximize impact. At the same time, I began cultivating allies. Not family allies. They were all too invested in maintaining the status quo, but friends, coworkers, and mentors who respected me and understood my capabilities. I shared vague stories of the family dynamics, carefully framing them in a way that highlighted my observations without sounding bitter or vindictive. The goal was to create a network of support I could draw on when executing the plan. I didn't need backup in a physical sense. This wasn't about confrontation, but I needed resources, information, and moral support. Knowing I wasn't alone, that there were people who recognized my value even if my family didn't, gave me a subtle but critical advantage. Next, I focused on timing. I realized that there was one family event coming up that was perfect. Melissa's engagement celebration had been small, casual, and contained within a house. But the upcoming wedding planning party, her official pre-wedding gathering, was a larger event with extended family, friends, and significant social visibility. It was the perfect stage. Everyone would be in a single space. Everyone's attention would be on Melissa and Jared, and everyone would be emotionally invested in the moment. It was the kind of setting where subtle manipulation could have maximum effect, and where I could carefully orchestrate my moves to make them impossible to ignore. I started preparing discreetly. I updated my wardrobe, not to impress them, but to make a statement. Subtle, clean lines, professional yet stylish, confident but not ostentatious. I wanted to appear as someone they had to acknowledge, someone who carried presence without demanding attention. I also began refining my social skills, how to enter a room, how to draw attention naturally without seeming desperate, how to engage in conversations that subtly shifted the dynamic in my favor. It wasn't about arrogance, it was about control. The next step was patience. Every day, I rehearsed scenarios in my head. I imagined how Melissa would react if someone contradicted her in public. I imagined how Aunt Marge might escalate a subtle dig if she noticed me smiling at a private joke. I considered Jared's possible moves, how he might try to assert himself or manipulate perceptions. By rehearsing, I wasn't obsessing, I was preparing. I was ensuring that when the moment came, I wouldn't be caught off guard, and I would be able to respond strategically rather than emotionally. But the most critical part of the setup, the piece that required the most discipline, was emotional control. I had to maintain composure at all times, regardless of provocation. The moment I let anger or hurt show, I would give them the upper hand, and all my planning would collapse. I practiced mindfulness, visualization, and even rehearsed conversations aloud when I was alone. I learned to recognize the precise moment when someone tried to provoke me and to respond in a way that maintained my dignity while subtly shifting power toward me. Every reaction, every pause, every word had to be deliberate. I also gathered intelligence outside the family circle. Social media became a tool, not a distraction. I tracked patterns in posts, guest lists, and announcements. I paid attention to who liked or commented on what, how Jared presented himself to the world, and how Melissa curated her image. It was subtle, detective work, but it allowed me to anticipate their moves and the potential impact of my own. Knowledge, I realized, was power, and I had more than I had ever had before. Finally, I began dropping small, inconspicuous hints of my presence. I attended gatherings in a way that was visible but non-threatening, allowed people to see that I was doing well, that I was respected in my own circles, that I had cultivated skills and networks independent of the family. These subtle signals served a dual purpose. They reinforced my own confidence and planted seeds of uncertainty in the minds of those who had underestimated me. I wasn't overtly confrontational yet, but I was subtly shifting the social landscape, laying the foundation for what was to come. By the week of the pre-wedding gathering, I felt ready. I wasn't just prepared emotionally. I was prepared strategically. I knew who would be present, how they would likely behave, and where their vulnerabilities lay. I had rehearsed responses, mapped out positions, and anticipated social dynamics. I had allies ready to provide moral support if needed, and I had a clear internal framework to prevent anyone from manipulating me emotionally. And yet, beneath all the careful planning, there was an almost imperceptible thrill. Not from revenge itself, not yet, but from knowing that I had created a position of strength I had never held before. For years, I had been on the receiving end of subtle manipulations, passive-aggressive digs, and orchestrated exclusion. For the first time, I wasn't just defending myself. I was preparing to assert agency in a space where they assumed I had none. The thought of walking into that room, calm, confident, and fully in control of my actions and reactions, sent a thrill down my spine. I reminded myself, though, that timing was everything. This wasn't about a public confrontation or shouting matches. This was about precision, quiet, calculated, undeniable presence. Every word, every gesture, every look would be measured. Every move I made would be deliberate, designed to reclaim power and dignity without giving them an easy target to dismiss. On the morning of the pre-wedding gathering, I woke up early, dressed deliberately, and spent an hour visualizing the event. I imagined every corner of the room, every conversation, every glance. I anticipated provocations and rehearsed responses. I reminded myself that my goal wasn't humiliation for the sake of revenge. It was reclaiming my presence, showing that I was no longer invisible, and asserting my right to occupy space that they had tried to deny me for decades. By the time I left my apartment, I was calm, focused, and, most importantly, patient. The stage was set. The players were in place. The opportunity was perfect. I just had to wait for the right moment to execute, confident that every subtle action I had taken up to this point had positioned me exactly where I needed to be. And as I approached the house where the gathering was taking place, I felt that same electric anticipation I had felt months earlier, but this time, it was tempered by control, strategy, and a growing sense of self-worth. I wasn't walking in as the overlooked cousin anymore. I was walking in as someone who had prepared, someone who had observed, someone who was ready to quietly, but unmistakably, alter the balance of power. When I arrived at the pre-wedding gathering, the air was already buzzing with the kind of excitement and pretense that only large family events can generate. Melissa was at the center, radiant, smiling, basking in attention, and Jared was hovering beside her, looking pleased with himself. The rest of the family milled around, exchanging quiet judgments and half-hearted compliments, clearly attempting to outdo each other in subtle displays of wealth and superiority. And yet, this time, I walked in with a different energy entirely, calm, composed, and entirely present. I wasn't here to be ignored. I wasn't here to be dismissed. I was here to take control of my narrative. I entered deliberately, catching the eye of a few of the cousins I had always had the closest bonds with. A small nod, a smile, and suddenly, I had subtle allies. Nothing was overt, nothing that could be misinterpreted, but the signal was clear. I was here, I was aware, and I was not invisible. My presence began to ripple through the room. just enough to make Aunt Marge pause mid-sentence, to make Melissa glance toward me and feel that tiny prick of uncertainty, to make Jared stiffen slightly. They had never seen me enter a space like this before, calm, poised, and quietly commanding attention. The first move was subtle. I casually approached the table where desserts were arranged, where Melissa had planned a theatrical unveiling of the engagement cake and dessert platters, designed to highlight her and Jared while relegating everyone else to secondary status. I smiled at the caterer, complimented the arrangement, and engaged in light conversation that was polite but confident. The trick was to do everything as if I belonged, which, technically, I did. I just wasn't allowed to feel that way. By the time Melissa noticed me fully, my presence had already shifted the room subtly. Heads turned as I laughed naturally at a joke, my voice clear and present. I could feel the discomfort begin to ripple. Melissa's hand tightened around her champagne flute. Jared's jaw flexed. Aunt Marge's smile faltered. Next, I waited for the perfect opportunity. It came sooner than I expected. As the group moved toward the living room for a series of toasts, Melissa, in her usual dramatic fashion, prepared to announce a special surprise for everyone. The kind of reveal she loved: attention, applause, admiration. She had carefully curated the moment to showcase herself and Jared as the perfect couple, and she assumed everyone would obediently admire them. But I had noticed a small oversight in her planning weeks earlier. The surprise involved a guest list and a set of personalized gifts that relied entirely on her coordination. One missing name, one disrupted plan, and the illusion could crumble spectacularly. I waited until she called everyone to gather around the centerpiece table. Then, in the calmest possible manner, I asked, "Wait, shouldn't Carter get one too?" The room froze. The question, so simple, so direct, reverberated with weight because Melissa had assumed I wouldn't speak up. Her smile faltered. Jared blinked rapidly. Aunt Marge gasped quietly, covering her mouth as if to stifle a laugh, or perhaps a warning to stop me before I unraveled everything. My mother's expression twisted subtly, a mix of guilt and surprise, but she stayed silent. Melissa's voice wavered slightly as she said, "Oh, I didn't think you'd want one. It's just for—" I interrupted, calmly but firmly, "No, I'd like one, please. After all, I'm part of the family, aren't I?" The subtle challenge, the quiet reclaiming of presence, hit them in a way no shouting match could have. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't angry. I was composed, deliberate, and suddenly, I had everyone's attention. Then came the cascading consequences. As Melissa fumbled, the caterer looked to me for confirmation of the details. They had been prepared for my inclusion, had my name on the list, and I smiled quietly, giving a small nod. The gifts were distributed, and I received mine as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A small, exquisite package, carefully labeled and ready, and the room collectively realized they had underestimated me yet again. The subtle hum of confusion began to swell into visible panic. I didn't stop there. Over the next hour, I moved strategically through the room, engaging key family members, drawing them into conversations where I subtly highlighted my achievements, my independence, and my growing confidence. Each comment was deliberate, each interaction carefully crafted to demonstrate that I had been quietly building my life beyond their narrow expectations. By the time dessert was over, I could see the ripple effects. Melissa's carefully curated image was cracking. Jared, who had always positioned himself as the clever, calculating fiancé, was forced to realize that his attempts to manipulate and control had failed. Aunt Marge's glee was replaced by visible irritation as she recognized that her usual tactics, mocking, undermining, exclusion, were no longer effective. Even my mother, who had been complicit for decades, looked at me with a mixture of surprise and the faintest trace of unease. The turning point came when Melissa attempted another dramatic gesture, calling for a toast to celebrate her and Jared. I raised my glass quietly, not in defiance, but in presence. My calm, deliberate motion drew attention, and I caught her off guard. The words she had rehearsed faltered as a subtle but undeniable shift occurred. The focus was no longer solely on her. I didn't speak. I didn't interrupt. I simply existed in the space with confidence and poise, a living reminder that the person she had tried to exclude was no longer invisible. The room's energy shifted. Applause and acknowledgement for her words felt tempered, hesitant. The carefully constructed illusion of dominance she had relied upon for years was quietly eroding. By the end of the evening, the fallout was complete. Conversations that had been dominated by Melissa and Jared, subtly adjusted as relatives I had quietly befriended, began to engage me more. I noticed subtle glances exchanged between family members as they recognized the shift. Aunt Marge, who had always thrived on small humiliations, retreated slightly, choosing her words with caution when addressing me. My mother, who had been complicit, avoided overt involvement, perhaps sensing that her usual leverage no longer worked. And Melissa, radiant yet unmoored, struggled to maintain the control she so desperately desired. Jared, equally unsettled, appeared to recalculate his assumptions about me, silently acknowledging that I was no longer the passive, overlooked cousin. By the time I left the gathering, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction unlike anything I had experienced before. This wasn't about humiliation or revenge for its own sake. It was about presence, dignity, and reclaiming the agency that had been denied to me for years. I had executed my plan calmly, deliberately, and without giving them the satisfaction of a dramatic confrontation. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't made a scene, but the impact was undeniable. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone had been forced to recognize it, whether they liked it or not. Driving home that night, I reflected on the transformation I had undergone over the past months. From the initial exclusion and betrayal to the quiet rebuilding of my life, and finally to this calculated assertion of agency, I realized something profound. My worth had never depended on their acknowledgement. Their attempts to diminish me had provided the fuel, but it was my own patience, strategy, and self-belief that had carried me to this moment. When I parked outside my apartment and stepped out, I felt a clarity I had never known before. The old dynamics no longer held sway. I had navigated the chaos, claimed my space, and emerged stronger, calmer, and more respected than I had ever been within that family circle. And for the first time, I didn't need anyone's approval to validate my presence. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and allowed myself a small, quiet smile. The journey had been long, painful, and deliberate, but it had brought me to a single, undeniable truth. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer dismissed. I was seen, acknowledged, and in control, and that realization, more than any confrontation or spectacle, was the sweetest victory of all. The family, the so-called golden children, the smug fiancés, they had learned something crucial that night, whether they understood it yet or not. Underestimating me was their greatest mistake. And for the first time in my life, I didn't just survive their games. I had won.